We want to go to the US, which obviously has seen an eruption of very aggressive policing over the last 3 days, mostly in response to peaceful protests. There has subsequently been looting, and over the last 6 or 7 hours or so, Donald Trump has come out and given a press conference. We're heading over to the West Coast to join Kavitha Davidson to talk to us a little bit about what's going on. Kavitha, first off, you're very welcome. Thanks very much for joining us this morning.
Absolutely, thanks for having me.
What actually happened overnight for people who are just waking up in Ireland?
Well, so for the last couple of days, there's been a pretty steady wave of protesting in cities throughout America. They're mostly peaceful in the daytime, and then cities have imposed curfews. And what starts as peaceful protesting turns into violence and destruction and some looting. And there's some pretty substantiated reports that the looting is outside agitators, it's outside groups trying to stir trouble and trying to kind of paint a negative light on the very peaceful protesters that have mostly been marching through the country.
Yeah, you've seen those pictures of the protests all day. You've seen the individual reporting of people who are at them, and it's clear the protests have been peaceful to 95, 97, 99% of the time. That message doesn't seem to have got through to Donald Trump. I just want to play this clip. Here is Trump addressing the nation last night. Have a look.
I am taking immediate presidential action to stop the violence and restore security and safety in America. I am mobilizing all available federal resources, civilian and military, to stop the rioting and looting, to end the destruction and arson, and to protect the rights of law-abiding Americans, including your Second Amendment rights. Therefore, the following measures are going into effect immediately. First, we are ending the riots and lawlessness that has spread throughout our country. We will end it now. Today, I have strongly recommended to every governor to deploy the National Guard in sufficient numbers that we dominate the streets. Mayors and governors must establish an overwhelming law enforcement presence until the violence has been quelled. If a city or state refuses to take the actions that are necessary to defend the life and property of their residents, then I will deploy the United States military and quickly solve the problem for them.
It's chilling, really, that this is his response to what's happened over the last 3 or 4 days, but they couldn't respond like this to save the thousands and thousands of people who have died from COVID-19.
It really is very telling. It's telling that there's a lot more outrage and there's a lot more, frankly, violent rhetoric against looters and rioters than there is about, hundreds of black men and women being shot down by police in our streets. We saw something really phenomenal and something that I've never really seen in my lifetime from an American president before, which was, one, the threat of military force against civilians for protesting, which he did in the daytime. And then he did something which will be on the front page of the New York Times, but it can't be overstated what he did. He had, in the middle of the day before curfew was imposed in Washington, D.C., cops in riot gear launched tear gas at peaceful protesters simply because of the photo op. There are multiple outlets that have reported that he was unhappy with the coverage that was given when he went into hiding in a bunker near the White House yesterday, and the coverage was not that positive. So in order to make a show of force, he tear gassed peaceful protesters in the middle of the day.
The other thing that he mentioned in that one, so that's a 6-minute clip. We just played a minute of it there. He talked about the Second Amendment rights. That's code for those people who are bearing arms, who we've seen kind of around the fringes of protests. There was one scene in Seattle where an undercover cop actually seized an assault rifle from somebody who was, it seemed like they were looking for trouble. And so essentially what he's saying is, if you are of a mind to bring your assault rifle to a riot, off you go, lads, and we'll have your back for that.
Yeah, it's absolutely frightening, and I can imagine how, those of you who aren't in America can be extremely confused by that, because obviously y'all don't have the gun culture that we do, but also you wouldn't have the leader of your country inciting that. He's very much inciting violence, and frankly, just for context for some of your viewers, this is part of a historical pattern. This is a tactic that Nixon used in his campaign to establish himself as, quote unquote, the law and order president. Obviously, in the late 60s, in a time of great civil unrest. So this is right out of a playbook where the president of the United States, President Trump, is trying to incite violence, and he's trying to sow discord. And he wants, if he wants people to exercise their Second Amendment rights in the middle of protests that are already volatile. A couple of weeks after we've seen people protesting, the COVID-19 shutdown by storming state capitals, also armed. He's going to get the violent outcome he seems to be seeking right now.
And we're in the middle of a campaign, so all of this has to be viewed through the campaign prism as well. What do you think is going to happen? How do we de-escalate this situation that we find ourselves in at the moment?
There's obviously a lot of rage. Like I said, most of the protesters are peaceful. There are definitely protesters who are angry and are hurt. But this does take de-escalation on the part of the police force. You have a lot of reports on the ground that these protests are peaceful until antagonism by police forces, before curfews are imposed even. So, we've seen some videos across the country that, some people call it propaganda, that it's propaganda for cops, and some people take it as very encouraging signs of, cops putting down their batons and taking off their helmets and just talking to these crowds. Because the underlying issue here really is that the police, who are, meant to serve and protect these communities, often don't connect with the communities they're supposed to be serving. So, we have seen some videos of cops kneeling with protesters and hugging protesters and understanding them in the daytime. And then by night, things kind of take a huge turn. But more of that de-escalation, more of that understanding, and frankly, we're not going to get it, but more leadership and more calming leadership at the top would be really nice to see.
Kavitha, could I just ask, in your view, how significant this feels in a historical context? That if you go back to the LA riots, does this feel this is on a level above that? Does this feel that there are different sides of the community coming together more than they've ever done in a protest fashion?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because I feel like we feel like it's a watershed moment every time something like this happens. I think back to 2016, when Eric Garner in Staten Island in New York, he's the first one that we had on tape saying, "I can't breathe" at the hands of a police officer. We go back to Mike Brown in Ferguson, St. Louis, near St. Louis, Trayvon Martin. Like, we can go down the line. In the last 3 weeks, the reason that this is at such a boiling point is because we've not just had George Floyd in Minnesota. We've also had Breonna Taylor in Louisville, Kentucky. We've had Ahmaud Arbery in Florida, in Georgia. I'm sorry. So it does feel like every time this happens, we feel like it's a watershed moment. This does feel different. And I'll say that because this seems to, the video that we have at least 3 angles. It seems like every day we have a new angle released. But the video that we have is of this man begging for his life, at some point calling for his dead mother. It's like you can't be a human being and not feel something, no matter what side of the political aisle you're on. When you're watching that. So what we're seeing right now is, obviously we're seeing nationwide protests. We're seeing people kind of on both sides of the aisle coming together. We have yet to see top level Republican leadership denounce what we've seen here. But, we're also seeing as much diversity in these protests than frankly I've ever seen. And I've been in quite a few Black Lives Matter protests in the last 6 years. And we're also seeing that in sports. We're seeing more white athletes, frankly, and more people in baseball and hockey and not just basketball and football speaking out against this. So it does feel like this is a watershed moment. But what will really need to happen is obviously we're going to need a conviction of the cop who was arrested. People are calling for the arrest of the 3 bystander cops who stood by and did nothing. But the more systemic change that we need, police reforms and an independent review, frankly, independent prosecution of cops when they're accused of doing something like this, because we've been dealing with this for decades and nothing systemic has actually changed.
Just on that point of a lot of sports people coming to the fore to make their voices loud and clear, Kavitha, is this a sense that this is on a greater volume than it was in 2016? Because it did feel around that time as well, there were perhaps people using their social media platform for a time and then perhaps faded into the background. It does feel that there is a lot more people coming to the fore very quickly. I mean, like, you look at it on a global level, you even have Jadon Sancho being part of the protest in his celebration in the Bundesliga at the weekend.
Yeah, we've seen demonstrations in the Bundesliga. There was a huge protest in Trafalgar Square in London. This does seem like a global thing. In the sports world, in 2016 after Eric Garner died, we had LeBron James and Chris Paul, Carmelo Anthony standing up at the ESPYs and talking about that. We had WNBA players team-wide giving demonstrations. And then, of course, we had Colin Kaepernick and the whole debate that his demonstration spurred. But it does feel like this is much more widespread. This is, we're seeing official team accounts, which is really quite something. Not only have we seen, players and coaches in white and black, we're seeing, for example, the Miami Dolphins releasing statements and half of the NHL teams releasing statements, on behalf of their team, which is something that we haven't really seen before. You can kind of be cynical, and I tend to be, which is that this is just so egregious and so, there kind of isn't two sides to this when you watch that video, that it's an easy PR play for these teams to be making a stand. But the other side of that is they never really have before. So it does feel like this is different, and it does feel like this would have to stick. The other side of that is George Floyd, in particular, was best friends with an athlete. He was best friends with Steven Jackson, an NBA great, NBA Finals champion from the late 90s. But Steven Jackson has taken it upon himself to be the kind of first athlete face of talking about this in this particular issue, because he was so close with George Floyd. So it feels like you're seeing people rally around Steven and rally around other athletes in a way that, you don't just have to be of the stature of a LeBron James or a Serena Williams to be talking about this.
Michael Jordan obviously issued a statement as well through the Charlotte Hornets account as well, which was interesting. It wasn't, obviously everybody's going to read whatever he says. It's going to be amplified. But what did you make of that?
Yeah, Michael Jordan speaking out is interesting. Tiger Woods released a statement today as well. These are black athletes that famously have not been the most involved politically. Here in the States, we just finished watching that great ESPN 10-part documentary, The Last Dance, about Michael. And, the famous line, Republicans buy sneakers too, of why he'd always kind of stayed apolitical in order to maintain his brand. I think it's interesting. I think that Michael Jordan's brand is enhanced, frankly, in 2020 when he does speak about these issues. And, you have scores of black men and black teenagers who are NBA fans who have always been disappointed that Michael Jordan hasn't been more vocal about things. On the other hand, that's always been his prerogative. So, you could see it as he finally gets it, or he finally has reached a level of his brand that it doesn't matter what he says and he can take a stand, or you could say he's being opportunistic. But it has been interesting to see players that we normally don't hear from, whether they're black or white, talking about this issue.
Yeah, Joe Burrow, the #1 overall pick of the most recent NFL draft, came out very early on and actually spoke out about it, which is a fairly interesting signifier about what his intentions are when he gets to the NFL, of actually being an outspoken participant in the real world as opposed to just a marketing machine.
Yeah, and Joe Burrow is a really fascinating guy. You know, he comes from a very poor white, rural background, and he's talked a lot about that as well, about white poverty in America, which is its own thing. But it is, he hasn't taken a single professional snap, but he has spoken out about this, and it was quite a tone setter. Like I said, we're hearing from white players throughout sports. We're hearing specifically from white quarterbacks, which is, the history of race in particularly the quarterback position in the NFL is such a fraught one. And obviously all of the power on and off the field is concentrated to the quarterback position. So to see, the Carson Wentz's and the Joe Burrows and even Trevor Lawrence in college, we're seeing these white quarterbacks really take it upon themselves. I think it's a sign of the times. It's a sign of sea change, and it's also a sign of, frankly, I think every generation gets more woke, for lack of a better word, gets more progressive, and has more of an understanding of these issues. So, hopefully it's a sign of a trend to start.
That's a really interesting point, that if society is going to get more conscientious about these things, more woke, as you say, as the years go by. The Michael Jordan example is quite a fascinating one then at this point, because as you say, it is totally his prerogative to not speak out when he wanted to. But this is the early 90s we're talking about, when Republicans Buy Sneakers Too comes out. This, hopefully, it becomes a vastly different scenario for an athlete to talk out, to speak out. If these protests result in something meaningful, the next Michael Jordan may then be comfortable to, publicly support somebody in a fairly divisive political race, as was the case in North Carolina in the early 90s.
Well, the next Michael Jordan is LeBron James, and he has been extremely vocal and very activist. And he's got this great HBO show called The Shop, where they speak very frankly about race and about political issues. What we also do forget sometimes about Michael Jordan is he was the first Black billionaire athlete. He created that as a business model. He was the first who created that path for people like LeBron James, who has said he has aspirations of owning a team at some point. That would not have been possible without the branding genius and the way that Michael Jordan paved for future generations. So it really is a little bit of a give or take here. Also, like you said, the mid 90s was not the mid 2010s or 2020. It wasn't. We very much were still in a you have to stick to sports mentality, and I know that that's something that people still throw around now. LeBron James has been told to shut up and dribble, but it's not, at the end of the day, detrimental to these athletes' brands. And once you've reached the wealth and the status of a LeBron James, you have the luxury of being able to speak about these things. Serena Williams has said, she's never been quiet about race, but you can tell, going back 20 years from when she was being called the N-word in Indian Wells in California and refused to ever play that court again. You can tell that every year she has gotten more strong and more successful and more comfortable speaking out about the injustices that she sees. So, without Michael Jordan really kind of paving the way for the money and for the success, I don't know if we would have a LeBron James, but that does also pave the way for generations of activist athletes to come.
Kavitha, you've been great with your time. Thanks very much for joining us late night there, early morning here. Take care.
Yeah, thanks for having me.